I'm Ben Chu, economics editor of Newsnight, and welcome to ResPublica and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's Conservative Anti-Poverty Month, a platform to discuss centre-right ideas for tackling poverty, all types of poverty in this country. This seminar is the fourth in the series, and the subject is unemployment, what the centre-right's approach should be to joblessness and the labour market more generally. So the US President Harry Truman once said, "It's a recession when your neighbour loses his job. It's a depression when you lose yours." So what have we just been through in that case? Well, looking back to last summer, it feels like we've dodged a bullet on unemployment. Back then, there were credible projections, including from the government's own official forecaster, the Office for Budget Responsibility, that total joblessness in the UK could rise to more than 11% of the workforce. That's above 4 million people. More than during the early 80s recession, a time that's still remembered as a tremendously scarring experience and whose repercussions we are still experiencing in some ways. But as it is, the headline unemployment rate today stands at just 4.7%, which is not that much higher than it was going into the crisis. And it's projected by the Bank of England to peak at just 5.4% later this year. Now, that would be an incredible outcome and obviously incredibly welcome. So is there nothing to worry about? Well, not so fast. There are still 1.7 million people on furlough, according to the latest estimates. And they all need to be reintegrated into the workforce over the coming months as the furlough scheme winds down, if we're to avoid a damaging spike in unemployment. The pattern of demand in the economy might have changed permanently as a result of the pandemic. Some jobs might have gone forever. The number of people in long-term employment has also risen sharply over the past year, as we're going to hear. In short, it's not going to be straightforward. We're not out of the woods yet. Public policy has a role to play beyond the furlough, which has been absolutely essential in helping us avoid the worst outcomes in the labour market. So what is the right policy for integrating those workers back into the workforce? Are skills and vocational policy adequately funded and optimally designed? Are the right people and institutions guiding it at the moment? How do we deal with insecure work? Should we tackle it through labour market regulation or by some other means? And how do we deal with in-work poverty? Should it be through top-ups via the benefit system or through direct interventions in the labour market, things like raising the minimum wage or cracking down on 0 hours contracts? And looking further ahead, what is the future of work going to be? And what would an effective centre-right policy on the labour market look like? So these are all essential and crucial questions for tackling poverty. And to discuss it, we've got a great panel today. Our speakers are Dr. Abby Adams-Prassl, Associate Professor in Economics at the University of Oxford, and she's going to talk about trends and key issues of unemployment in the labour market. We also have Dave Innes, the Head of Economics at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. He's going to be talking about the links between poverty and unemployment. We also have Skidmore MP, a former universities minister, and he's going to be talking about lifelong learning and how it's vital to tackle unemployment. Finally, we have Damian Collins MP, who is a former chair of the House of Commons Digital Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, and he's going to be focusing on the question of the gig economy and workers' rights. So each of them are going to speak for around 10 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for a general discussion. So please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them in due course. And if you want to tweet about the event, do so using the hashtag Tories Against Poverty. So that's enough for me. Let's go straight over to Abby. Over to you, Abby.
Great, thank you so much for the kind introduction, Ben. Now, to help me with my presentation, I'm just going to be sharing some slides. As Ben said, I'm an Associate Professor in Economics at the University of Oxford, and back last year I co-founded the COVID Inequality Project, Between September and March, I've been a specialist advisor to the Women and Equality Select Committee, focusing specifically on the gendered economic impact of the pandemic. And now a lot of my kind of prior expertise before kind of COVID hit has been in really how do we harness new forms of big data, of unstructured data to understand current and future labour market trends. What I'm going to be showing to you today is largely a little bit more mundane. It's just going to be kind of key labour market statistics, but important nonetheless. Now, in a sense, you might think, it's kind of interesting that we're talking about unemployment, as Ben said, given that actually in historical sense, unemployment, even in current times, is relatively low. So these two figures here show you how employment rates have changed over time since 2006 on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, we have the unemployment rate. And what we can see is that if we look at, on the eve of the crisis, actually the UK economy had record high employment rates, record low unemployment rates. Now, of course, things have been changing a fair amount over the last year and are set likely to change even more so as we move into the third and fourth quarter as furlough is wound down. And as been said, we see kind of a range of estimates from different government departments coming in at the range of the low 5% to mid 6.5%, around 6.5% figures in terms of where unemployment might peak towards the end of this year as furlough is wound down. Another thing to bear in mind is that these headline rates do mask a lot of heterogeneity in actually who is out of work. And one of, I think, the worrying things that you can see in terms of who has lost their jobs, who is unemployed over the COVID crisis, is that this is disproportionately affecting young workers, for which we know there are kind of lifelong scarring effects of unemployment whilst in youth. Also, as Ben said, another thing which is going on in the background here is, of course, the huge success of the furlough scheme. So the furlough scheme has essentially frozen the UK jobs market since last year. However, some work that I've been doing in the background in terms of actually surveying furloughed workers, trying to understand, especially people who are furloughed now, or people who have basically been furloughed the entire time since March. Now, they are looking very similar in terms of their outlooks for the future, in terms of how are they searching for jobs, like what are they worried about, to those who have been to the unemployment. So I think there's really pretty credible evidence to suggest that a lot of these people are not going to be necessarily reabsorbed by their current employers back into the labour market, and the more that we can do to get out early to help with that transition, the better. Now, something which is also kind of in the background underlying some of these results is that if you look at how the structure of employment has changed since the financial crisis, we see big changes in the UK jobs market. So this is what's showing you in terms of since the financial crisis to the eve of COVID. This is showing you the total change in employment and then also changes in self-employment. And what we can see is that if you look at the total growth of employment from the financial crisis to the eve of COVID, 47% of that is made up of increases in self-employment. Another thing is it's not just self-employment, the nature of employment has been changing. So work that I've been doing, there are big issues with how we measure flexible work and insecure work in traditional labour market surveys. One of my main research projects over the last couple of years has been systematically analysing over 60 million job vacancies in the UK since 2014 and analysing what the terms actually offered in job contracts are to actually try and understand how the nature of low wage work and high wage work has been changing. And what you can see is that whilst it doesn't look like that much is going on in the LFS, actually, if you look at the terms offered in job contracts, we've seen big growth in the flexibility of work since the financial crisis, so that now around 30% of jobs advertised in the UK specify some kind of flexibility, but that is disproportionately in low-wage jobs and non-salaried. and in jobs which actually are offering very, very narrow terms. So flexibility here, which is something I'll talk, well, I probably won't have time, but flexibility at the top and the bottom of the labour market are completely different things. And at the moment we use that language in, I think, inappropriate ways to describe actually very different types of job opportunities. So really, when we're thinking about flexibility in low wage work, I think that the language needs to change into more thinking about control of working patterns. Now, gig economy in general, because I know that Damian is going to be talking about this a little bit more. Now, we've got like quite a lot of evidence which really suggests that gig work and some of these 0 hours contract jobs, the benefit is that they have low barriers to entry. What does that mean? It means that if you get a shock or you become unemployed in your main job, the good thing is that these are available for you to kind of quickly move into and quickly top up your income. So these graphs here are taken from some work done in the US, showing how riders are how Uber drivers are using this kind of work to top up issues that they're having in, if you like, their main jobs. The problem being, so we've now also got more evidence about what are the long-term consequences of actually shifting from a kind of a more stable employment relationship into gig type work. Now, the evidence there suggests that actually medium and long run outcomes might be worse for workers who actually shift into these forms of employment. Now, causality here is obviously kind of tricky, but nonetheless, using the best types of methods that we use, what it seems to suggest is that people somehow get stuck in these forms of work where they have no employment progression and less security, and somehow find it difficult to transition back into a kind of to the traditional, if you like, labour market. What does this mean in terms of the jobs market more broadly? Well, since the financial crisis, we have a massive productivity issue in the UK. If you start thinking about the composition of employment, perhaps that's not so surprising. If you think, when we think about what are the terms on which workers and firms actually want to invest in a relationship, well, you're going to run into the kind of big hold-up problems if workers aren't feeling commitment in terms of their employers, and employers aren't feeling committed in terms of their workers. So there's a lot of economics which suggests that this is like that some of this isn't particularly surprising if there isn't a lot of commitment in terms of relationships to actually put those costs into investing in the skills required to actually make an employment relationship as profitable as possible. The other thing, which I know that Dave is going to talk about, so I'll just kind of leave it here for him, is that whilst we have these record high employment rates, this is not translated into big reductions in poverty over time. So the big reductions that we have seen in poverty since the early 90s are really coming through old age poverty and pensioner poverty. But if you look at, so this shows you kind of poverty rates, relative poverty rates after housing costs for different groups in society, actually, basically, there's not much change or even increases when you look at the poverty rates for working age non-parents, and basically static in terms of those with children. So I don't have enough time after all of that to go into any detail really in terms of what I think the policies should be to help tackle this. But what I wanted to do was just in my last kind of 2-3 minutes, lay out kind of different clusters of policies or different ways forward that we might want to discuss more in the Q&A. So you can kind of think, or at least I think about there being 3 types of kind of pillars of this. How do we think about incentives for firms to both take on unemployed workers, but also crucially to actually invest in employment relationships such that there's a kind of, you build career paths such that individuals can actually meaningfully get out and stay out of poverty. Second, how do we think about incentives for workers to move into the workforce and invest in skills? Third, how do we think about the types of investment activities that governments should be prioritizing? Lots there. I just wanted to kind of come up on a couple of themes with this. In terms of employers, there's a lot to do, but actually there are some things on the books which would make a big difference. For example, the employment bill, which again was missing from the Queen's speech this time. I'll leave that for Q&A. So lots of work has been done on that. Something more broadly is how we think about the structure of taxation and actually how we incentivize firms to structure their employment activities in particular ways. So as we've seen, self-employment is a growing feature of the UK jobs market. Self-employment is also differentially taxed, is taxed differentially, and we also see that the self-employment are particularly vulnerable to poverty and low income. Thinking about a redesign of the national employment system, given that we have this delinkage anyway between contributions and benefits and systematic differences in rates paid across the self-employed and employed, I think that needs to, be pushed up the spectrum. In terms of some different types of, but this is both worker incentives and investments. Something I find, I said I was a specialist advisor to the Equalities Committee. Something that I have found kind of quite striking in terms of economic discourse, especially over the crisis, is that childcare and care in general is kind of thought of as not an economic issue. It is. So we need to think about childcare as an infrastructure, as something akin to roads, as something akin to, is something which allows half of our workforce to actually, well, not half, but anyway, a large proportion of our workforce, those with caring responsibilities, to actually get out and work, and as a high return infrastructure. Also, those families with children are disproportionately likely to be in poverty, both in work and out of work. And also in terms of investments, again, I think I'm going to need to wrap this up. We're in the UK, we're massing big opportunities in terms of a jobs-led green recovery. I think that if you needed any more kind of convincing that actually a green recovery makes economic sense, I think if you look at some of the discourse around engine number one and getting the and the changing of share and the changing of directors at Exxon, I think that'll be something really important for people to look at. This is something which is not just about kind of ideology. This is actually something which is going to be a growing feature of our economies in years to come. Recessions are great times to invest in new technologies, and green technology is disproportionately high labor. So there's like kind of big opportunities that we're missing there. Finally, I'm a data-driven economist. I do a lot of kind of data work. There are there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in terms of utilizing cross-government data resources, both in terms of targeting on both the worker, but also on the firm side. So I would be really interested in more conversations about how we can focus actually bringing more firms into more into this conversation. We know which employers have most of their workers on furlough still. We know which employers, or we can at least find out, are disproportionately likely to be employing people who are on UC through matching different sources of government information. You see the Low Pay Commission, you see others saying that we need much more exploitation of those information sources so we can spend money in the most targeted way. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Abby. That was a really great overview. And I really like, and I think it's very important, the point you made about distinguishing flexible work and insecure work, because obviously flexibility is something that sounds very good, and the government is legislating to entrench it. But if the flexibility is all on the side of the employer rather than the employee, it's not the same thing. But I wanted to just follow up, given that we're setting the scene. How big, do you have a view about how big the size of the sort of the low income insecure workforce is? Because we see a lot of estimates, and some of them are a lot bigger than others. What's your view about the size of the problem of what's often called the precariat? How big is it in your view?
I think that's a great question. So as I mentioned, there are big issues with how we actually measure 0 hours contract work and insecure work, not just in this country, more broadly. So yes, what you can look at, if you just look at the number of 0 hours contract workers as measured in the LFS, you're like, wait, this is like a teeny tiny percentage of the workforce. Why are people getting so head up about this? That's why what I've been doing is actually looking more systematically at what are the types of jobs that are being advertised in the UK. And there what we see is that actually about 30% of jobs are being advertised as flexible, but half of those would seem to be, i.e., well, so 13% of all jobs in 2019 were and you like highly likely to be this insecure category. And of course, that's not equal across all forms of jobs. Maybe for the Q&A, I'll get you the precise number in different wage bins, because I've got that. But this is actually a significant portion of the labour market, like 35% of jobs that are being advertised at low wages. And so why is that not showing up in a 0 hours contract? Well, these things are a spectrum. So what we kind of see is that your employer might say, I'm going to guarantee you, say, part-time work, but any hours above that actually as and when according to the needs of the business. And when you're paid by the hour, that's directly translating into earnings insecurity.
Okay, so I mean, 35% of jobs, you're talking millions there, aren't you? You know, around about 9 million. So it's a very large number. Yeah,
and again, it's kind of for this idea that at the moment we're obsessed with labels when we think about the labour market. Are you a 0 hours contract worker? Or are you a flexi hours worker or an annualized hours worker? Whereas what I think actually we need to be focusing on is actually how stable are people's earning streams, and what's the commitment there from firms and workers in terms of how many hours are going to actually be worked each week. And at least from the job vacancy data, there are differences obviously between vacancies and jobs that get filled, but the jobs vacancy data suggests that this is a big feature of the UK jobs market, and definitely at low incomes.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. Well, let's go straight on to Dave Innes for his thoughts. Dave.
Thanks very much, Ben, and thanks, Abby, for that brilliant overview of where we're at the moment. So I wanted to start with just a few things that I've learned over the past year, which I think are really important. First is that more than half of full-time low-paid workers have less than a week's notice of their work schedules. That really links to what Abby was talking about the prevalence of insecure hours of work. Secondly, half of care workers, who of course have been on the front line of the pandemic for the past year or so, earn less than the real living wage. So that's about £9.50 an hour, or a bit higher than that if you're in London. And then third, so if you're on a 0 hours contract or a temporary contract, that made you about 4 times as likely to lose your job in the first lockdown as someone who's the same age, working in the same sector. I think each of these facts is really important and tells us something about our labour market. Now, the first 2 of those facts aren't really to do with the pandemic at all. They tell us about the situation we were in going into the pandemic. And I think, as Abby said, the title of this event is about unemployment and poverty. But actually, pre-COVID, unemployment was becoming quite, much less of a problem in terms of the drivers of poverty than it had been. Had this record employment rate with more than 3/4 of the working age population in work. And that should have been fantastic news for reducing poverty. Rising employment rates should generate falling poverty. But something had gone wrong, as Abby's chart showed, like that there's this kind of broken link between rising employment rates and what you'd expect to happen in terms of falling poverty. So we saw working age poverty rates remain stubbornly high at around 1/5 of the working age population in poverty. And what had happened is that more people in work was lifting some people out of poverty, but what we call a rising tide of in-work poverty was pulling about the same number of people back in. So you had these kind of 2 competing forces there. And that meant on the eve of the pandemic, we had about 1 in 8 workers in poverty, which is just simply too high. So it's really important to understand the causes of that rise. And some of those causes of the rise in in-work poverty lie outside of the labour market. So workers, like a lot of people in poverty, have been affected by falling benefit incomes and rising housing costs. But when we've looked into it, work itself was becoming less effective at providing adequate earnings to support a family on it. And that's the case even as the national living wage was introduced and raised to a record level. And what we found is that many working families are being pulled into poverty by these insecure and volatile earnings, and also underemployment. So that is, not being able to find the hours of work in the labour market that you actually want to do. So, you can be in work, but still looking for more work and not have access to it. I think it's a really important point. It's also a point where the data tells the same story as what we hear on the ground. So for the last couple of years, we've been working quite closely with a group of people who are experiencing in-work poverty or have been experiencing in-work poverty. And we've heard from those people just how difficult it is to plan working family lives around low-paid work, where the shifts change each week, where you're not sure how many hours you're going to be working the next week, and all the while trying to juggle childcare commitments, and also with this kind of deeper feeling that work isn't offering them the opportunities to develop and use their skills that they would like to, and the opportunities to get on and progress in work that they'd expect. So I think it's pretty clear that pre-pandemic, this low-paid, insecure work was holding people back, but it was also actually holding our economy back as well, for lots of the reasons that Abby mentioned. There's now kind of this growing recognition that the prevalence of low-quality work holds down workplace productivity. So we know that insecure work itself lowers morale in the workplace, and also businesses invest less in the skills of developing their staff if they are transient staff, as opposed to on permanent contracts that they've got more of an incentive to develop. And when we look at the stats, the UK businesses are some of the least likely to provide workplace training to staff of countries that we think of as our competitors. And particularly if we look at those sectors where poverty is highest, those businesses are the least likely to provide training to their staff. So, as well as being really important to raise living standards for many people now trapped in poverty, delivering better jobs should really be a key plank of building a higher skilled and higher productivity economy. But that was the state of work pre-pandemic. And as Ben and Abby have both already said, during the pandemic, the furlough scheme so far has done a remarkable job of keeping unemployment low. So we have had successive kind of huge concerns about how high unemployment could get, and it fortunately so far has not reached those levels, with the official unemployment rate consistently outperforming forecasts. And I think it's also important that the furlough scheme has actually offered most protection to jobs in those sectors like retail and hospitality, where there are highest rates of in-work poverty. So there has been a lot of protection provided for those jobs. But the third fact I started with showed that those very same workers, people on low-paid workers on insecure contracts that were struggling to make ends meet pre-pandemic, have also been most likely to slip through the gaps in government support during the pandemic. And for those that did slip through the gaps, we should now be really concerned that about 750,000 people have now been unemployed for more than 6 months. And we know just how damaging a long period out of work can be for workers' job prospects and future living standards of them and their families. But if we think where we are now, recently we've seen some green shoots of recovery from the pandemic. And I think now is the time we really need to think about what sort of labour market we want to rebuild from this. And thinking about where we were pre-pandemic, a labour market where most people can find work, three quarters of the population in work is good. That's a good situation, but a labour market where 1 in 8 workers are in poverty is just not good enough. Right? We can do much better than that. And I think the pandemic itself has shown two things. First, it's brought the quality of work for many on the front line of the pandemic really into sharp relief. But secondly, much more positively, I think it's shown that compassionate, bold policies such as the furlough scheme have shown the huge potential of government policy to steer people through changes that we've been going through, but also changes in the future as well. And overall, COVID might speed up some structural changes. Decline of retail, we might see this kind of Zoom shock, moving jobs and people out of city centres. But COVID is not going to fundamentally change the problems of in-work poverty, unemployment and insecure work unless we see a step change in policy focused on building back a better labour market. So as I say, now I think is the time to raise our ambition for what we think the labour market can and should do. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the other ideas from the other panelists this morning. So thanks to them for the time to kind of think about such an important issue. Similar to Abby, I wanted to finish with 3 quick thoughts, so I won't go into too much detail, but 3 quick thoughts of things that I think need to change if we are going to create a labour market without such high rates of in-work poverty as we had pre-pandemic. First, we need to set better standards of the quality of work that we expect. For example, workers should have proper notice of shift patterns and compensation for any last minute changes. It's just not right that so many workers, as we just talked about, face the impossible challenges of balancing volatile working patterns and their family life. As Abby said, the government have already committed to an employment bill which will tackle many of these issues, which is great. But now is the time to bring forward that bill and act to provide workers with the greater security that they need. The second area is we need a kind of step change in the amount we invest in basic and vocational skills. These skills are essential to enabling workers both to get into work, but also to kind of chart a course through the stormy seas of the labour market that we've seen during the pandemic and are likely to see in future years. There's actually some evidence that investing in these skills helps individuals, but it can also change the quality of jobs on offer in the labour market as well. So it can actually see us, lead to a situation where we see what we call skills upgrading of jobs rather than a kind of polarisation between growing low and high wage skills that we've seen in recent years. And that's definitely what we should be aiming for. And then the last area I wanted to mention is I think we should have a bigger focus on what businesses do in those sectors where low quality, low productivity work is concentrated. And our work on that area has shown that it's impossible to improve both productivity and the quality of work in those sectors if we can incentivize and encourage businesses to do things like improve their management practices and invest in their staff through in-work training. So that's a very quick romp through a few areas that I think need to change if we're going to build back this better labour market that we all want to, and do that for our workers that are currently trapped in poverty. And I'll look forward to hearing the ideas of the other panellists.
Thank you very much, Dave. Before we come to Chris and Damian, I just wanted to, I was struck by your statistic about care workers, and 6 in 10 care workers are on 0 hours contracts. I was wondering, has your work looked at the sort of the sector breakdown of this problem of insecure work? Is there some sectors where it's a particular problem like care? Are there other sectors where there's very good practice and perhaps we could learn from? Have you looked at that sort of breakdown of practice and that question?
So I've just seen Abby nodding to say kind of there's some sectors where it's better. So the work we've done is shown that kind of insecure work is very concentrated in the sectors where people are at risk of poverty. So very concentrated where low paid work is most likely to be, and the sectors we normally pull out there, retail, hospitality, care, those are the kind of sectors that we see both the kind of people very likely to be struggling to make ends meet, and also high prevalence of low paid insecure work. I don't know, Abby, did you have something to add on that? Because I know your work's looked into a lot of this in more detail.
No, I was kind of nodding, so it's a great question. But I do think so. In some of the government reviews, both the Taylor review and the review on 0 hours contracts in 2015, before that, I think there was some really interesting case studies from particular employers who had good employment practices within sectors where where 0 hours contracts or where poor work is more prevalent, and if you like, creating a positive business case for investments in workforce. So maybe we can share some of those resources to those on the call later.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That's something we've seen as well, with some really positive examples in sectors like retail and hospitality, where employers have taken a different approach and moved from that kind of one-sided flexibility that suits the business to providing flexibility that actually benefits the worker as well. And a lot of that's kind of fairly anecdotal evidence of improving productivity, because it's really difficult to measure, but there does seem to be some evidence that can really help as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Right, well, let's go to Chris Skidmore now. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Ben, and thanks to the two panelists before me for some incredibly erudite and data-rich presentations, which I probably don't have the sort of capacity to be able to mirror that. What I wanted to focus on today was some of the work I'm doing actually with ResPublica on our lifelong learning education. As you mentioned, Ben, I've been universities minister, and obviously even before the pandemic broke, there was a strong debate in government, outside government, around the future patterns of post-18 education. And I think furlough provides us probably with a moment to take stock and to think about the future of our training programs, particularly in post-18 education, and also for the future of the labour market. I'm sure Damian would agree with me. Every member of Parliament's constituency casework seems to include now the hospitality sector, the pubs, the restaurants in local areas, particularly rural areas, which are desperate to find staff and cannot. And it seems that there is a sort of inbuilt imbalance, particularly post-Brexit, which we obviously a sort of EU labour market sort of plugged a skills gap, a vacancy gap that was there, but I think highlights the problem, the structural imbalance that we have in the UK, that we focus too much on short-term demand and plugging that short-term demand, and not enough on the long-term supply issues around employment. And obviously that one of the longest-term supply issues is education itself. It's completely a pernicious, vicious cycle that we've seen amongst communities that don't recognise the opportunities that education can bring and the impact that can have on their future life chances and unemployment patterns. We all know, and I think the Joseph Rowntree research that I've certainly seen on their website demonstrates that particularly that link between educational achievement and poverty remains a vast and desperate one. So for those without 5 good GCSEs, 44% of people are in poverty. That drops to around 22% if you've got 5 good GCSEs, and then down to about 10% if you are a graduate. Now, obviously, you've seen certain communities across the country never escape that educational poverty trap. So while those are national statistics, the fact is we've got about 1 in 9 adults of working age with no qualifications at all. Yet we break that down by constituency. There's some constituencies where that level is around 2%, but other constituencies like Birmingham, Hodge Hill, or in Glasgow, where it raises up to about 30%. And so therefore, what do we need to do as a government, as a country, to be able to have a far more targeted approach to tackling educational underachievement and employment opportunities than what we've had at the moment? And I would say that what we've seen in the past has obviously been a push towards getting sort of educational achievement raised in schools, educational achievement raised at universities, but that's often sometimes focusing on the institutions, the providers themselves, judging the providers as a benchmark of success, rather than charting through the individual learners and those journeys and make sure that those aren't lost within the provider-led system. So one idea I would suggest for discussion would be actually let's have a levelling up education fund, a levelling education fund that is micro-targeted at specific communities. When I was universities minister, I felt that a huge amount of work on access and participation, again from an institutional level. So it was encouraging, sucking in individuals to the university as a mark of the university's success. They'd managed to bring those from deprived backgrounds there, but didn't actually tackle the fact that when you look at white working class boys, for example, they're the lowest sort of number of demographic to actually go to university. And what I would say is that we should move away from some of the data measures that we have, such as POLAR, focusing on participation in local areas at quite a wide level, to a much more finer ingrained level data, maybe at sort of indices of multiple deprivation that could really sort of focus by household on how we can sort of as a public sector target individual interventions for the future. I would also say that when we're looking at the sort of the agenda around the part-time learning, which obviously has dropped off a cliff since 2010, we've seen things like the adult community learning budget fall by 32% since 2009. Hold our hands up as a government and say we failed these individuals by focusing perhaps on full-time education and not enough on what the part-time opportunities might be for those in work. And some of that is also structural around the welfare system. I think we're probably not going to be seeing sort of up ratings in universal credits being able to be carried on, but what we should be looking at is actually how the interface of universal credit works with the demand for future skills training. Because at the moment we can promise as many lifetime skills guarantees as we want, but it's not going to work unless actually there's a reform at a welfare level, particularly around universal credit, and particularly around this 16 hours when it comes to part-time education. And also individuals who are on a course, and if they get a job, have to then trade that course and make a decision whether to give that job up. And I entirely agree with what Dave said around this whole idea of somehow transforming the skills pipeline. Actually, the transformational change we need for the green economy means that, yes, we've got to be focusing on the cliff edge around employment versus unemployment, but also right the way through to postgraduate level opportunities. If we want to be a global science superpower, we need 250,000 extra people working in R&D, both in academia and in industry. And yes, we can offer opportunities up for global talent visas, and that's great. But again, that's falling back into the same trap of focusing on demand and not on domestic supply. And so therefore, I think the opportunity we have here is to rethink the skills pipeline so that at every level we provide those opportunities, which simply aren't there at the moment. If you want to do postgraduate study, 30% of your loan is classed as income under universal credit. And actually, when you look at the maintenance loan that you have as a deprived student, that's deducted from universal credit itself. There's so many opportunities, I think, within the system to be able to reevaluate what education should mean for those who are either on universal credit or those who simply don't have the opportunity to learn. And I would classify within that, a issue with the lifetime skills guarantees, obviously focusing on level 2, the 37% of those under 25 who have level 2 or below qualifications. Yet we know we have 26% of 25-year-olds and unders who reach level 3, and yet only 4% actually go to level 4, level 5. And that obviously is one of the aims of the government's programme around addressing the issue of post-18 education, to open that up into the FE sector, into looking at sort of non-degree qualifications, and modular learning is going to be absolutely essential to achieving that. But modular learning must be interfaced with the world of work and giving those individuals the opportunity to learn and earn at the same time. And I think when we come to understand issues around other barriers, the additional ELQ rule at the moment. So if you already have a degree, if you have a level 3 qualification, you can't trade downwards, you can't trade sideways in order to be able to reskill and retrain. That must end. That's a massive barrier to be able to transform the world of work for the future. And I would finally end just on an issue of student finance, because obviously that's a sort of hotly debated topic when it comes to looking at university entry, and obviously the nature of debt and whether debt should be written off at a certain level is obviously something that's going to be covered in the spending review. But this has got to be seen in a wider context of opening up student finance to non-graduates, to those who are wanting to access further education routes, modular learning routes. All those have got to be somehow financed and giving the individuals the opportunity to access education. And I would say that we have a real issue when it comes to those students from more deprived backgrounds whose loans are higher as a result of accessing maintenance loans, debt reaching £52,000 for the most deprived 40% of students, opposed to 38,400 for the 20% least deprived students. And you have arguments on Twitter about saying, well, the debt's going to be written off, people shouldn't be thinking about this, but it doesn't really deal with the reality of individuals about the perception of debt and what this means. And I think we need to be focusing far more on, I think, underwriting maintenance loans so that they become grants, because actually the loans themselves are being written off, so why shouldn't they necessarily be grants? There's no additional cost to the government, in order to encourage individuals, particularly from backgrounds who see debt as corrosive and holding themselves back, as a means to accessing education for the future. So those are just a couple of points, and I'm sure we can open this up for discussion. But I do see this as an opportunity to transform the world of work for those who not only are unemployed, but for those who skill level simply doesn't equip them for the future world of work post-COVID.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Chris. I'd be interested to get your views quickly as a former universities minister. as you know, the critique of previous governments is that there's too much focus on higher education. Is one of the reasons why lifelong learning and skills have been neglected, and that, you know, that's the whole focus needs to change. And we need to talk less about kids going to university and more about going into to these other forms of training. Would you agree with that? And do you think it has, to a certain extent, crowded out that very important agenda that you're now focusing on?
No, I don't. I don't see it as a binary divide. I've always said there should be a unity of purpose between both FE and HE, and it's, you know, a crying shame that certain media outlets decide to pitch one against another. You know, the reality is this should be about educational ambition and transforming educational ambition, and setting that within the wider international context that sees educational ambition for a you know, fourth industrial economy being recognizing that graduate status is the ultimate sort of status to aim for. And we know that that acts as a huge insurance mechanism against unemployment when you look at graduate status versus non-graduate status. You know, what I find tragic is somehow that we find it acceptable that parts of the population will be categorized as being graduates and non-graduates. Everybody should be aiming for graduate status on a journey, an educational journey, and for some that might take longer than others. But that's where I hope the modularization approach, the sort of bite-sized learning that could come in, both in terms of, you know, thinking about alternative routes for those under 25 or even those beyond 25. You know, there's 600,000 people in higher education who are older than 25, and we never really sort of focus on this and their needs, the childcare needs that were talked about by Abby earlier on. I think we need an approach that sort of ends this divide, because ultimately everyone should be on that journey. They can decide when to get on and off, depending on their individual circumstances. But ultimately, I want more higher education being offered in the further education sector. I want more FE and level 4, level 5 qualifications being offered in the higher education sector. I think that's how probably some universities will be able to cope with a fee cut, if that comes in, to be able to mask some of the damaging impact on their finances. But I ultimately, you know, every mind has the opportunity, if it wishes, to be able to push itself further. And whether that's in HE or FE or in employment-based training as well, we should welcome that.
Excellent. Right. Well, let's go over to Damian, who's going to talk about the gig economy. Over to you, Damian.
Thank you very much. It's been great to join the discussion. And the COVID pandemic has led to a big shift into online retail, online business. For many people, their first real exposure of this will have come about in the last 18 months or so. And it has accelerated trends that were already there away from the physical economy to the virtual economy. And will have a similar impact on the labour market. As this sector of the economy grows, it also will create a lot more jobs. The most recent figures I've seen for employment in the gig economy was 4.7 million people in 2019. And we should assume that that number will grow significantly, probably has significantly grown in that period of time. As Abby mentioned earlier, not all people that work in the gig economy by any means are solely employed within it. Many will work in it as a means of securing additional work. And in 2019, when this was studied, it was anticipated then that about 70% of people that worked in the gig economy had some other form of income. That still means about 30% who don't, which is still a very significant number out of that 4.7 million people. But what we should, I think, look at now is that this is an important and growing sector of the economy. It is a sector that could be increasingly important to people's return to work, particularly as many businesses that have previously traded in physical premises and on the high street no longer do so. And I think we should understand the difference between sort of flexible work, casual or part-time work, as referred to in the past, and the reality for many people that work in the gig economy today. Now, of course, the term gig economy really comes from the music industry. The idea is you turn up, you perform, you get paid, and you go away again. And that's what the gig economy is, which means you get paid. You get paid for turning up and working, but not necessarily at the same rate or the same amount. the flexibility someone might have had, let's say someone who had a part-time job working at Debenhams, in a Debenhams store that is now closed down, decided to enter the gig economy. What would they find that is different about the way they work? Well, yes, you could have some flexibility to try and get hours to work at a certain period of time. If you were successful doing that in a shop, then you would know you would get paid, you would turn up, regardless of how many customers you served, you would get paid at the end of your shift, and you would go home with that money secure. A similar worker in the gig economy will find they may register to work a certain number of hours on the platform. Depending on what hours of the day are, the amount of work that is generated could be highly variable. Nevertheless, they are committed to be waiting for work to come through. They are waiting around unpaid to receive work, and therefore the amount they may earn within the period of the hours that they've agreed to work may be far less than the minimum wage if it's not a very busy time of day and not many jobs come through. Therefore, the reality for people who find themselves working in the gig economy and need that to be a principal source of income or a major source of income for them, may find that rather than having a job that fits well around study time or childcare responsibilities, where you could choose the hours of the day that you work and get paid to work in them, that you simply do not earn enough money working at hours of the day where there's not very much work. And therefore you are forced to work far more hours than you otherwise wanted to, or in reality, you're forced to work at certain hours of the day. Because many of the gig economy businesses are not required to pay their deliverers or drivers if they are not receiving jobs, then there's no particular incentive for them to regulate the number of people working at any one time. And therefore, even if you do choose to work at peak hour demand of the day, say you're a deliverer driver working for a food delivery company, working in the hours when people are more likely to be ordering food to be delivered, you might find that you don't get that much work still because there are too many people out there working. Or you might find again that maybe because you haven't worked enough hours in the previous month, that even if you are bidding for jobs, you never get them because other workers have a preferred status. And there's no transparency, no idea around how the recommendation tools that rank gig economy workers perform. Now, of course, another big difference, not only are you in a situation where you are committing to a lot of waiting around time, where you are sort of waiting for work to come through for which you're unpaid, you also receive none of the benefits that many people who do work in the physical economy get. So if you are a food delivery driver and you have an accident whilst conducting your work, then you get no cover. There's no sick pay. There's no relief for you at all that you would get if you were injured in the course of doing your job. For many other companies, you are totally vulnerable in that regard. Obviously, you're not treated as an employee by many of the gig economy platforms. And in that situation, you get none of the in-work benefits, accrued holiday pay, pension contributions, national insurance contributions that would come from ordinary employment. Now, of course, many people like the flexibility of being freelance workers and will work for a variety of different companies. But if you are out of necessity being trapped in a form of work where you're required to be there, but you're not paid unless you're actually serving. But like, working in going back to working in Debenhams, you'd only get paid for each item you sold, not for the amount of time you're actually working in that site. So if you're committing to a lot of unpaid work where you're required to be on demand, to make any kind of living, you have to be on demand a lot. And if something happens in the course of your work, you have no cover. And I think we should be saying to ourselves now, does that feel like a working environment that should be the norm for increasing numbers of workers? And actually, this is being done for the convenience of this is a very convenient way for the companies that create these platforms to reduce their costs, maximize their margins, and make a lot of money. And they're making that money on the back of people who, out of necessity and having nowhere else to go, are being asked to give up any rights to a minimum level of pay, give up any rights to protection and cover in the line of their work, and increasingly find themselves having to be on constant demand for the jobs that they do. And for people actually who don't necessarily want to be freelancers, they want to be contracted to a company, they want to have employment rights, the benefits that come with that. Is that fair? There's a question as well, is it fair for other businesses that can't be structured in that way, that have to cover then all the additional costs of paying workers a fair rate, paying their workers the minimum wage at least, paying national insurance contributions, paying into their pension, their accrued pension pots, all those additional costs that those employers take on, and they may be having to compete against gig economy businesses that have none of those costs at all. And I think we need to look at this in the context not just of workers' rights then, but also a level playing field for how businesses are regulated and taxed. we see the sector of the economy that is under the most pressure, things like high street retail, are competing against businesses that can get away with paying their workers a lot less, not having to manage worker rights or having employees with any kind of representation at all. They are structured in a way to minimise paying any company taxes or any business rate taxes, and yet they have all those then inbuilt advantages that people in the physical economy don't. So we have a system at the moment which actually incentivises businesses to switch to a gig economy model, incentivises businesses to switch offline and move away from the physical working environment, because there are massive tax advantages to doing so, massive cost reduction advantages to doing so. And I think we have to say, who are the winners of that economy? And it's certainly not lower paid workers. So I think what we need to do now is look again at this and say, there's no consistency in the way the sector is regulated, and indeed different businesses now perform differently. Now, to Chris's point earlier on, which I completely agree with, we are seeing high levels of demand for employment within the economy. So that may change some of these working practices. A company like Just Eat treats its gig economy workers as employees and gives them particular benefits. Some companies guarantee a minimum income for hours for logging onto a shift, which is then topped up depending on the amount of work you do during that period of time. There are some companies that are switching in that direction. So maybe if the demand is there, and therefore the demand to get people to sign up to your platform, that will help drive up standards, but it might not, because there will be a lot of people for whom this is their principal route back into the working economy. So how do we, I think, create a level playing field and create some minimal standards for people that work in the sector around protection and cover, to be treated like employees in terms of their tax status and their in-work benefits, if that is what they would prefer to do, rather than being a freelancer working across many different platforms, to allow people to accrue a holiday time and in-work benefits and have a minimum level of income. And I think these are reforms now we need to look at in the upcoming employment bill. So we set common standards. At the moment, we're seeing standards set by some companies that have higher ambitions for how they want to treat their workers, and also in some cases by the courts, who are now ruling that gig economy workers are in effect employees. We saw this in the recent case against Uber, but I don't think this should be driven just by corporate policy or by high court rulings. I think it's time that we have some consistent rules for gig economy workers across the economy.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Damian. I just want to follow up on asking a question. When Uber is challenged on its practices and other gig economy workers, they often reply that when they do surveys of their workers, they find that the vast majority, they say, are happy with the arrangements that they have, and the people complaining are very much a small minority. And their implication is, well, people have choice. People are choosing to work in these gig economy companies with these particular practices. When you hear that argument, I'd be interested in how you would respond to it.
Well, I'd love to know how they conduct the surveys, because I think most people that work for Uber will be terrified about saying anything critical about the company. Where you can be kicked off the platform for no good reason, you could be given a lower star ranking as a driver, which means you would get no work. At any moment, you're entirely at the whim of the platform in terms of your ability to access work or even work at all. So I'd be very surprised if current employees would be that critical of the company for those reasons. If you're someone who sees work, say being a driver for Uber, as being a way to earn a little bit of extra money on top of another job you've got, you're not reliant on how much money that is, but it's a bit extra, then yes, you may regard this as a perfectly good and reasonable arrangement that helps you as someone who's happy to work as a taxi driver to connect you to people that are looking for a ride. However, if you're someone, and I suspect this is more likely to be the majority of them, who is undertaking this work in the expectation of earning a certain amount of money, then you may find yourself in a position where you have to work far more hours, because many of those hours are unpaid, than other people in other forms of work do. Your success in getting jobs is reliant on an algorithm which you have no oversight of and no understanding of how it works. You've got no ability to complain or make representations to the company if you think you're being treated unfairly. I think that, for me, doesn't feel necessarily like a flexibility. That feels like a way of working, which is where your employer has maximum flexibility, and actually your flexibility is a mirage. What you have to be is on standby at the whim of the company if you expect to make any kind of money out of it.
Excellent. Well, We're going to go to the audiences and the participants' questions now. I think we had a couple of questions on this subject of the gig economy. So I'm going to stick with that just because it feels more organic. I'm going to read out a question by Kevin Langford, first of all, which I'm going to stick with you again, Damian, because you talked about regulation being the sort of the main approach. Kevin's question is, to what extent is there an argument for some kind of higher minimum wage requirement in the gig economy to reflect waiting around time? I mean, this would obviously apply to people on platforms like Uber, but even answer that direct question if you would, but also broaden it out. Is it about regulation, or are there other levers which government should be looking to pull as well? Because we've had a question from Mark Morin, which is related to this. He says, would a workers' charter, example for workers in digital platform businesses, provide greater security and benefits, including ability to learn and upskill? So just talk a bit about what levers beyond regulation might be necessary to tackle this problem that you identified, Damian, first of all.
Well, I mean, I think you can have a charter of standards, but the question then is, will those companies enforce it? And what rights to representation do workers have if they feel the company is operating below the standards of a charter, and is there anything anyone could do about it? I certainly think the issues will certainly be there that having a minimum amount of income, on which you then may get paid per delivery on top. Creating a basic level of minimum income for registering for hours worked would help address the issue of unpaid waiting time, which is one of the biggest grievances that most gig economy workers raise when independent research is done to speak to them about their working conditions. It would also mean that the platforms would have an incentive to make sure there weren't too many people logged on to work at any one time in any one area, to make sure there was likely to be enough work to go around. It would give them an active incentive, which at the moment many of them don't have. I think if you had something that covered unpaid time, I think costs associated with the job. So for many gig economy workers, they may bear the costs of the transportation and the equipment that they have as well, and therefore what they're earning after they've paid those costs. Having a fairer system on that as well, and some sort of cover for people that are actually injured in the line of their work. Those would be all the sorts of things that will be more normally associated with employment. It would still give people the flexibility of choosing the hours that they work, but it would give them some sort of protection and some guarantee of some sort of minimum income. And I think would give the companies who employ them, and I think that's what they are basically, is employed to deliver this service. They are totally integral to it. It would give those companies a more active incentive to look after and manage their workforce more effectively.
Great. Let's bring in Chris Skidmore on this question. Chris, I wonder what your view is on how best to tackle this issue of the gig economy, because there is, I think you probably agree, a balance between allowing innovative new forms of employment to continue, but also protecting workers. How do you think that balance can and should be struck by governments?
I was thinking earlier when sort of Damian's made his contribution, also sort of Abby showed sort of her data. There's a sort of moment I remember thinking, almost sort of Joseph Kennedy-like, where people were sort of coming to me on my own high street in Kingswood and Hanham, even before COVID broke, sort of to say, I'm a hairdresser and I've been made to move to a self-employment model that sort of, actually the wider pattern here is, yes, you've got the gig economy, you've got the sort of, an economy of convenience, demand-driven, which is occurring, but also that structural issue underneath that's sort of seeing a gig economy emerge in traditional sectors that would have seen employer-employee relationships be sort of, rather traditional ones. And some of the pressures, have come anecdotally, I understand, from employers around sort of pension contributions, obviously sort of the rise in the levels of the sort of national minimum wage now, sort of the national living wage, and the demands that are then made of employers and their responsibilities. And I think what we don't do enough is we focus obviously on the sort of the needs of the employees, but sort of where there are opportunities for employers to maybe be making investments in their firm, and how we can recognize that those investments are sustainable ones that will benefit their firm if they are able to invest in human capital. And all the focus is often, we've got sort of Rishi Sunak's now big sort of capital spend program that's now been announced. But where is the equivalent for training. And I think, what we've seen also is that, historically a massive investment by employers in employee training even before the rise of the gig economy. So we've seen a sort of divestment of rights, of responsibilities. We focused on rights, but we don't really focus enough on where are those responsibilities and what could be sort of a new charter of responsibilities. And so I would sort of argue that within the tax system, we should be able to engender a sense of a better responsibility. We've got the sort of R&D tax model, for example, that allows for credits to be sort of invested on the firm on R&D activity. But I would say that a lot of R&D activity is done at a sort of human level without even being sort of recognised. So part of it's around the sort of metrics, changing that. I think we've got to be able to bring individuals back in-house, as it were, to re-establish those traditional relationships of employer-employee before they're severed forever. And I think that's where I think we should be focusing our attention specifically also on trying to rebuild those relationships that have separated, have parted. Because the focus obviously on the gig economy, on the sort of Ubers, on Just Eat, or all those sort of new forms of business is important, but it shouldn't distract us from what is also happening at a far wider level across the rest of the country through existing companies.
Great. Let's Mike, if we can bring in Clive Chapman, who's asked a quite interesting question.
Clive, you should be on, and can we ask you to unmute, please? Thank you.
Hello. Yes. In the UK government's domestic commitment to reduce poverty, there's a single measure on the quality of work, which is about average hourly earnings. And I wondered what that might have to tell us about how politicians and policymakers see the realisation of the common good and their responsibility on that front.
This is an interesting question, because obviously it's natural in a way to focus on money and income if you're talking about alleviating poverty. But I suppose Clive's point is also pointing about there's wider things than money to care about. It's the quality of work, it's the good that jobs do. So maybe I could bring in Damian on this one. Are we in danger of falling into the trap of just thinking about incomes and not thinking about some of these wider public good issues that Clive talks about when we think about the labour market and these questions?
So I think it's an interesting question. I mean, I think firstly, in answering it, I'd sort of pick up on what Chris was just talking about, which is that there's a slight danger that the sort of commoditization of the workforce, that's for some businesses, their workers are entirely disposable. They turn up, they do a job, they go away. If they don't come back, then there's someone else you can bring in to do the same piece of work. And to some extent, the gig economy is an extreme version of that, where you don't even regard the people who work for you as employees. And therefore there's no investment in that workforce. There's no relationship between, and there's no development within there, because the business doesn't really see that as its responsibility. And there was, I think if you go back many years, you'd see companies investing in sports clubs and entertainment programs and sort of welfare programs for their employees. They regarded them as their people, and the betterment and improvement of that group of people was good for the community and good for the business as well. Many businesses simply don't have that sort of relationship with their employees. So I think that is something that is missing. It's not just about the gig economy. I think it exists across the economy, and I've heard some people talking about certainly big industries that are based in cities, and particularly in the north of England, where they say the only real relationship that business has with the city is the fact it happens to be based there. And in terms of the wider cultural life of that community, those links that probably in the past were very strong don't exist in quite the same way. And on the other hand, I'd say I wouldn't. Don't get me wrong. I'm not sort of saying that I think the gig economy is an entirely bad thing. I think it's just allowed certain things to develop, which for the increasing number of people that work in it, I think means that a lot of the people that do work in it have very minimum standards compared to what other workers enjoy. And actually, I think they're below what they should expect. I think it is lower than what people should reasonably expect, and therefore it's something that could be created. But the fact it exists also means that other businesses have been able to do things they wouldn't otherwise been able to do. Many of the restaurants that now do takeaway food deliveries can only have developed that business, that new line of business, because of COVID, but it's been facilitated by delivery platforms that make it possible to do it. So it has allowed innovation elsewhere, if you like, in the traditional economy, and therefore it is not all bad. But I think the reason I think you do end up focusing on employment standards and income is that is the sharp end, of working in those sorts of jobs. It is what extent is it reasonable to expect people effectively to work unpaid for a large part of their working shift, because they have no minimum income and they're entirely reliant on recommendations from the platform that they work for. To what extent do we think that is a reasonable way to work, which allows people to plan? I mean, if someone working in a system like that can't sit down at the beginning of the month and say, okay, I'm going to work these shifts on these days, and I know at the end of that I will have earned this amount of money. You simply cannot plan that way, and therefore someone might say, well, okay, if I've got to earn that amount of money, I'm going to have to as we go through the month, I'm going to have to start massively increasing my shift patterns, which could affect other things as well. So I think it doesn't give people the flexibility that externally it looks like it does.
I know Dave wants to come in, but I just want to briefly throw it to Chris, because it's interesting that as Universities Minister, you'll know that a lot of the value of a university degree is often looked at on the basis of how much its people who take a degree go on to earn. Is there a danger, do you think, of looking at the value, looking at incomes rather than these wider questions in your view?
So the real problem we have with a graduate sort of outcomes-based system is, again, the data that we are relying on, the longitudinal education outcomes data. We're using a 2008 system to try and measure 2018 and beyond, 2021 sort of systems of employment. So if you are self-employed as a graduate, you could be the head of a unicorn like tech company, yet you don't actually count in that longitudinal educational outcomes data. Self-employment doesn't feature. And so there are vast lacunae as a result of that system. And I would add also, there's a real issue around levelling up here with the measurement that we use, because obviously universities help to retain employment in their local areas, particularly around sort of NHS teaching provision. If you go to university, often then you stay in that local area, you stay in the hospital system, you stay in the school system that you've been sent to train in. And that isn't measured also. So I think we need a far better place-based approach to recognising what graduate opportunities there are for the regions. Because alternatively, if it's just simply based on salary, then we're rewarding individuals who've gone from Sheffield to get on the train to come down to London to get that higher salary. But that's at the detriment of actually stripping out local regions of the skills pipeline they need in order to be able to grow their regional economies. So I think there are a number of huge structural issues that have emerged, partly from having a central national system. As I pointed to in my early contributions, we can look at the top line figures at a national level, but that belies huge disparities at regional levels when you come to break down this data. But the data itself is out of date, desperately out of date, and it doesn't reflect that transformation that Abby spoke around, when it comes to self-employment and the revolution that we've seen.
Great. And Dave, do you want to come in on this question?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I'll come in quickly with just a couple of points. So I thought there's two interesting things about this question, actually. So first is the kind of wider well-being issues that Damian and Chris have touched on. So absolutely, we hear from lots of people we work with, we all want to go out and have a job that we feel like we are making use of our skills in, and we are flourishing to some extent in. And just for too many people, work does not feel like that. So people talk about being treated like numbers as opposed to people in various jobs, or they talk about how frustrating it is. They might move jobs and have to repeat pretty much exactly the same training as the job that they've just been in because it's not recognized by their new employer, and they're kind of caught in these kind of really frustrating cycles without progressing anywhere. So absolutely, that's a really important issue. But the other thing I thought was interesting about that question is that specific metric of average hourly earnings. And I think what we measure on this is really important because it does often dictate what policy aims to target. And one really important thing here is that actually we've seen really quite different movements in household earnings than we have in hourly wages in recent years. So at the bottom end, there's been quite a lot of progress on hourly wages in terms of raising the national living wage, but that hasn't translated into improving living standards for people who are in low paid work because of all the other sorts of issues that we've talked about, like volatile earnings, like not being able to find enough hours that you want in work, like the rise of kind of gig economy and other sorts of volatile work as well. So there's something really important about getting that metric right that we're then going to target through government policy as well.
Great. And Abby, you wanted to come in as well, I believe.
I was going to make a very similar point to Dave. So this is perhaps a slightly unfair characterization, but I think you think about policies over the last 5 years to support the bottom end of the labour market, it's essentially been about average hourly earnings, i.e. it's been about the minimum wage. And there has been studies which, and that is leaving out a lot of things in terms of how we both think about earnings and how we think about work quality. But when minimum wages aren't embedded in a kind of a bigger kind of labour market strategies, you can get some perverse consequences. So there has been work showing that, at least in social care, you can link the rise in minimum wages to increased prevalence of 0 hours contracts. Doing it at the whole economy level is difficult because national minimum wages, national level, so it's difficult to work out what the counterfactual is. But yeah, it was just to kind of exactly say what Dave said. But this isn't just about UN development goals. I kind of think this is actually about policy over the last couple of years, by and large.
Great. Let's change tack slightly. If we can, Mike, if we can bring in Ying Jin to ask a question about green employment prospects.
Ying, if you can unmute, thank you.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Ben. This is mainly a question for Abby, and Abby mentioned the green sector jobs. Given that there's still quite a lot of uncertainty in terms of the technology and also development in general, to what extent at the moment is a good option to go for? And very much like you to look at, for example, the labor intensity issues and also productivity issues of the industry.
I'd like to broaden this out slightly because, as Dave mentioned, some of the sectors with low income and high insecurity are things like retail, which have a very labour intensive. To what extent, this is for everyone as well as Abby, should we be focusing on building employment in sectors which employ a lot of people, and how do we trade that off against the sort of the quality of the work in those? Because one of the criticisms of some of the high-tech industries is that they pay high wages, but they don't create much employment. So there's some difficult issues to grapple with there. But let's first of all, let's go to Abby and get your view directly on how important green employment is going to be and how labour intensive we can say that sector is going to be.
I think that's a great question. So there's been work done by the OECD. There's also been a number of studies which have come out of the Institute for New Economic Thinking at Oxford and the Oxford Martin School, kind of looking at the labour intensity of different green policies, including upgrading energy efficiency, investments in renewable technologies, and also have a kind of more kind of community-based environmental upgrading type policies. There's huge, and there is a lot of potential there, was my reading of this evidence, for kind of labour intensive type technologies and type investments to be made, and also ones which don't require particularly high skills. So there are actually, in terms of that, those policies which we want to focus on, which is high labour intensity, low barriers to entry, those reports, which again, be happy to share afterwards, would suggest there's upside. The other thing, some of these investments in terms of are about, if you like, kind of getting our infrastructure right for the next 10, 15, 20 years. So it's true that whilst you might think that some of these investments aren't going to still be employing lots of people in a couple of years if we've done our job right and actually set up the kind of infrastructure to move on this green transition, actually, I don't think that's a huge, I don't think that's a big issue. So if what we're thinking about is we're going to have a spike in unemployment the end of this year, we've got a stock of people who have either been on furlough for a long time or have been unemployed since the start of the crisis. Finding low cost, a high value add on a social scale activities which they can do and which will give them skills which are going to be increasingly relevant as we look into the future. I think that the evidence would suggest that there's still a lot of bang for buck there.
Would anyone else like to come in on this sort of green employment question?
I got a couple of points quickly, which is, so I sort of feel like on this, and on the broader question of kind of maximising employment opportunities, I kind of think there's two things that we need to do. So one is kind of, just pay close attention and work out where those opportunities are, and there probably are some. So, specifically on the green employment question, specific example is, retrofitting homes, which we're going to need to do. That's a specific area you could go, and there needs to be some investment in skills. It's probably not huge, but it's kind of feasible to get that level of investment in skills to do that. But that is a big employment opportunity we could be taking more advantage of. But the other point I think is really important is, recently our economy has actually been pretty good at producing jobs overall. It's not the problem that we've had of producing an overall number of jobs. It's ensuring all those jobs are sufficient quality. So I think there's actually something we can do, all the broad things that we've talked about bringing forward an employment bill, about the things Damian's talked about improving job quality in the gig economy, to just say, the volume of jobs is not our problem. We can do a lot to improve the quality of jobs our economy is producing.
Great.
If I agree with that about, I think there's nothing wrong with, in terms of like offering training for jobs that exist. I have this discussion quite a lot with the FE colleges in my constituency area as well. We've got there's a shortage of qualified trained people to work in the construction industry, and we have construction training facilities as well. So I think to direct people towards sectors or encourage people to look at sectors where jobs are being created, and retrofitting, low energy equipment in people's homes will be a major task over the coming decade. The other thing I think is potentially interesting is whether technology could also make certain jobs more viable than they've been in the past. So I've often thought that if you look at fashion and textile as a sector, a lot of the work that used to be done in this country was offshored many years ago, and we've got into a habit of factories, particularly in the Far East, making very large quantities of garments, which is shipped a huge distance with the view of minimising cost. Actually, if you said, well, could you have a model where where there are more creators and makers making and selling their own stuff, using technology to reduce their marketing, promotion and shipping costs within the country, that are very responsive to changes in the weather or changes in fashion? And actually, could we be saying to many young people that actually, if you wanted to work in that sector, what you could think about doing was actually making sure you have the sufficient skills where you could actually quite early in your career start your own micro business and use technology to make that work, and even sell it at a price point within your region that is competitive with the high street. And I think it'd be interesting to look at many other sectors like that and say, well, is that possible? And certainly if you're then looking to bring back work that was otherwise offshore to the Far East, that's going to have a very positive impact in terms of the environment as well.
Thank you. We've got a question from Jeff Knoll, which I'm going to read out. It says, with the reduction in inward migration and difficulties in getting visas, etc., will the unemployment rate inevitably fall due to demand supply issues? And I want to throw this one to Chris Skidmore. There is an argument, as you probably know, that the UK over the past decade has relied too much on migration, and that's to some extent crowded out building domestic skills. And I wonder, do you feel if we do move into a phase of lower migration, relying less on foreign workers, that will actually perhaps help increase our productivity and help the labour force in some ways? Or should we be looking, as many employers are saying, to liberalise it, actually, to get import workers with the skills we need? What's your view on that?
I don't think we're going to reach some kind of equilibrium point where suddenly having changed supply that sort of demand is going to meet in the middle. I think it's far more complex a question. The deep-grained fault lines we have around a lack of a highly skilled population are going to take years, if not at least a decade, to be able to remedy. And we need, I think, to be able to, as the convening power of government here is around. We mentioned around green jobs. I'd add to this. We need some big ticket decisions being taken on certain industries. If we're then to look at trying to develop the skills pipeline as well. So the nuclear industry. We need a fleet of nuclear reactors, standard reactors, as well as small modular reactors for the future. We need to make that investment now and then build the pipeline behind it if we're going to achieve net zero, for example. I would say that when we look at sort of the visa pipeline, we're talking such small numbers, I think, relatively to the sort of vacancy rates that are going to be there. Even before the coronavirus hit, we'd always had a sort of stubborn 700k sort of vacancy rate in the economy, and I don't see that closing sort of anytime soon.
Yeah, and maybe I could just bring in Abby here, because there is huge uncertainty about the extent to which foreign workers, migrant workers, have left the UK during the pandemic, and how many have left, and how many, if they have left, will come back. Does that throw a spanner in the works of trying to analyse what's going on and what will happen in the UK labour market, and obviously to unemployment and poverty over the coming years?
Completely. So what you see is so our two main labour market surveys, or not surveys anyway, in the UK, so we've got the Labour Force Survey, which is worker-led, and then we've got the annual survey of hours and earnings, which is done mainly through employers. And what you see is not just big declines in response rates over the pandemic, but also systematic patterns in who is not responding, including including a lot of issues with foreign-born workers in the LFS. And so you've seen a lot of the LFS doing, and the Office of National Statistics doing as much as they can to kind of correct for kind of weights, to try and kind of correct for this as much as possible. There's a huge amount of uncertainty. I'm on the Low Pay Commission's kind of advisory group around data, when we were thinking about, okay, so how is it that we can actually analyse the impact of the most recent minimum wage changes? It was, the answer is it's super, super difficult. And that's why we see greater use of job vacancy data, is why we see greater use of HMRC real-time earnings data. Basically, what we're trying to have to do at the moment is put together a lot of different sources of information to kind of triangulate, to triangulate trends. And that does create a lot of issues, as you say. I think a lot of the key points which we've kind of picked up on today, though, however, around the issues with the quality of jobs, of what types of sectors are kind of growing, declining. I would still say that, I wouldn't say that there were any red flags for me in terms of the discussion today about things which are particularly uncertain on in terms of the overall direction of the labour market. I think the issues are going to be kind of just like the actual magnitudes of trends, and being able to kind of pick up when we think about the recovery, and we think about so how is it that the work quality is changing as we move out. That's where we're going to need to be quite, I think, quite innovative in terms of using these new sources of data.
Right, and I want to come to you finally, Damian, because we are almost out of time, sadly. When you hear employers saying that we need more visas for workers to fill these gaps, what's your response? Is that, we had this question of immigration in the referendum and it was settled, it's time to build up domestic skills, or do you have some sympathy for those calls?
It depends on the nature, as always, depends on the nature of the work, So, if, say, take tech industry and the creative sectors, where we say, well, we're a world leading center, of expertise. Well, probably part of the nature of being a world leading center often is that you need to bring in talent from around the world to sustain that. But there are many jobs where the question is, well, what role should employers play in training people for work? And I sometimes think when you hear sometimes employer organizations, I always think it's the employer organizations rather than individual businesses necessarily saying, we need people to be leaving school work ready. I actually think the businesses themselves also have responsibility to when they take on younger people in particular, to say, actually, we want to take that person on, we want to train them to work for us. We see them having a career with us, which they can progress if they work hard and they take on board the training that they're given. And I think what many businesses will have to look at now is actually the role they play in attracting and training people into the workforce and giving them a career path. And I think this goes back to what we spoke about earlier about the extent to which, for certain business models, they don't really see that as their responsibility. They expect they can just cherry pick from a market of people that are already qualified to do the jobs. They've no real ability to train them. They're not offering any progression, and they expect a pipeline of people coming through. And actually, I think employers will have to adapt in that market.
That's a great point, and a great place to finish, actually, emphasizing the responsibility of employers in all this. It's not just about government, it's about changing the whole framework. And I think that's a key message which has come out of what we've talked about. We've talked about so much. Abby and Dave have talked about the size of the problem and not relying on headline statistics. Chris talked very compellingly about micro-targeting support measures and about the interactions of the benefits system, the way employers work, and also the education system, which is absolutely crucial, that nexus. And Damian, as we've been talking about, laid out really clearly the problem with the gig economy and the role of the level playing field, which is often underemphasized in that other companies are being undercut by these practices. So I can't do justice to everything we've talked about, but I think it's been a really excellent discussion. So thank you to all of you for taking part. This is the fourth in the series. Tomorrow is the final in the series and the subject tomorrow will be on rethinking social security. It will take place between 2 and 3:30 tomorrow, and it will be involve Fran Bennett from Oxford University, Helen Barnard of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, Stephen Crabb MP, and Lord Freud, the former Minister of State for Welfare Reform. So do join that, sign up for it. Thank you for taking part. It's been a pleasure to be involved with it, and very best of luck, and thank you so much.